Imagine a forest where the trees whisper secrets no one dares to hear, where a winding path hides a story so haunting it'll claw at your heart and refuse to let go. This is Paws on a Broken Path, the dog who waited beyond the rain, a tale of loyalty, loss, and a mystery that lingers like fog over a grave. Meet Rusty, a scruffy little dog with eyes that see more than they should, and Ollie, an old man whose final steps lead to a darkness neither could escape. What begins as a simple walk down a familiar trail twists into something horrible, something that'll make you question how far love can stretch before it breaks. Was it just an accident that shattered their world, or did the path itself hold a curse waiting to strike? Why did Rusty stay, bleeding and broken, when the rain wouldn't stop and the shadows grew teeth? 6 parts, 6 secrets, each one peeling back the layers of a story that's as heartbreaking as it is chilling. You won't see the end coming, but you'll feel it in your bones. Like this tale, hit that like button. Share it with someone who loves a good mystery, or a good cry, and subscribe, because Rusty's waiting, and he's got more to tell. Let's step onto the broken path together. The forest path wasn't much to look at, just a worn trail of dirt and pebbles snaking through the trees, flanked by ferns that brushed against Rusty's legs as he trotted along. It smelled of damp earth and pine, a scent that clung to his scruffy fur like a second skin. Rusty was a small dog, no bigger than a sack of flour, with a coat that looked like it couldn't decide between brown and black. His ears flopped when he ran, and his tail spun like a windmill in a storm. To anyone else he was just a mutt, a stray who'd wandered into the wrong life. But to Ollie, he was everything. Ollie shuffled behind him, his boots dragging through the dirt. He was older than the hills, older than the rusted mailbox that leaned crookedly outside their little house. His hair was a wispy gray crown, thinning at the top, and his hands trembled when he gripped his cane. It was a simple stick, whittled from a branch years ago, its tip worn smooth from countless mornings on this very path. He wore a faded coat, patched at the elbows, and his eyes, cloudy blue like a sky before rain, followed Rusty with a quiet pride. They were a pair, these two, bound by something deeper than words. Every day started the same. The sun would barely peek over the horizon, painting the forest in soft gold, and Rusty would nudge Ollie's hand with his wet nose. The old man would groan, bones creaking as he rose from his chair, but he'd smile, a small, crooked thing that lit up his face. "All right, you rascal," he'd mutter, grabbing his cane. "Let's see what trouble you find today." And off they'd go, down the path that stretched from their doorstep into the heart of the woods. Rusty loved the walk. He'd dart ahead, chasing the flicker of a butterfly's wings or the rustle of a rabbit in the underbrush. His barks echoed through the trees, sharp and joyful, a sound that made Ollie chuckle despite the ache in his legs. If a squirrel taunted him from a branch, Rusty would plant his paws and growl, as if he could climb the trunk and catch it. Ollie would watch, leaning on his cane, his breath puffing out in little clouds. "You'll get one someday, boy," he'd say, though they both knew he wouldn't. It didn't matter, the chase was enough. Sometimes Ollie fell behind, his steps growing slower with each passing month. Rusty would notice, he always noticed, and double back, circling the old man's legs until he caught up. Ollie would pat his head, fingers lingering in the tangled fur. "Good boy," he'd whisper, and Rusty's tail would thump against the ground, a steady beat of love. They'd stand there a moment, just the two of them, the forest stretching out like a green sea around them. It was their world, small and perfect, carved out of routine and trust. But that morning, the path felt different. The air was thick, heavy with the promise of rain. The trees loomed taller, their branches knitting together overhead, blocking out the weak sunlight. Rusty's paws sank deeper into the soil, leaving prints that seemed to vanish as soon as he lifted them. He didn't chase butterflies today. There were none to chase. The forest was quiet, too quiet, the usual chatter of birds replaced by a stillness that pressed against his ears. Ollie hummed a tune, an old folk song about lost love, but his voice sounded thinner, like it might break if he pushed it too hard. Rusty stopped near a bend in the path, his nose twitching. There was a smell, faint, but wrong. It wasn't the clean rot of leaves or the musk of a passing deer, it was sharper, bitter, like something buried too long, and unearthed by mistake. He pawed at the dirt, uncovering a small stone stained with something dark. Ollie didn't see it, he was too busy watching his own feet, making sure they landed where they should. "Come on, Rusty," he called, his voice carrying a faint edge of strain. "Don't dawdle now." The dog obeyed, but his eyes kept flicking to the sides, to the shadows that seemed to ripple just beyond the trees. He stayed closer to Ollie than usual, his tail low, brushing the ground instead of wagging. They reached the old oak, their halfway mark, its trunk wide and knotted with age. Ollie eased himself down against it, his breath rattling as he settled. Rusty sat beside him, resting his head on Ollie's knee. The old man's hand found its place behind Rusty's ears, scratching in that spot that made the dog's eyes half close. "You're a funny one," Ollie said, his voice soft. "Always looking out for me." Rusty whined, a quiet sound that wasn't quite happy. Ollie didn't hear the worry in it. He was too tired, too lost in the comfort of the moment. He leaned his head back against the tree, staring up at the gray sky filtering through the branches. "We've got a good life, don't we?" he murmured. Rusty didn't answer, but he pressed himself closer, as if he could shield Ollie from something he couldn't name. The walk back was slower. Ollie's cane sank into the softening ground, and his steps faltered more than once. Rusty stayed at his side, matching his pace, his ears flicking at every snap of a twig. The forest watched them, its silence growing heavier, like a storm waiting to break. By the time they reached the house, Ollie's face was pale, his hands shaking as he fumbled with the door. He collapsed into his chair, and Rusty curled up at his feet, watching him with wide, unblinking eyes. The first raindrop hit the roof, as Ollie closed his eyes, his chest rising and falling unevenly. "Good boy," he whispered again, barely audible. Rusty's tail thumped once, but his gaze didn't leave Ollie's face. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows, and the path disappeared into the gloom. Something was coming, something neither of them could outrun, but for now, they were together, and that was all Rusty needed to know. The rain came without warning, a sudden roar that drowned the forest in gray. It had been a quiet morning until then, the kind where the air hangs heavy, and the sky seems to sag. Rusty and Ollie were halfway down the path, the old oak still visible behind them, its branches swaying like a warning. Rusty's fur was already damp from the mist, his paws leaving shallow prints in the softening dirt. Ollie trudged along, his cane sinking deeper with each step, his breath puffing out in short, labored bursts. He hadn't hummed today, his lips were pressed tight, his eyes fixed on the ground as if it might betray him. The storm hit fast. One moment, the world was still, the next water poured from the sky in sheets, turning the path into a river of mud. Rusty shook his head, droplets flying from his ears, and barked, a sharp, anxious sound that cut through the downpour. Ollie didn't hear it, or if he did, he didn't show it. He kept walking, slower now, his coat clinging to his thin frame like a second skin. The wind howled, bending the trees and whipping the rain into their faces. Rusty stayed close, his tail tucked, his eyes darting between Ollie and the path ahead. It happened in an instant. Ollie's foot caught on a root, hidden beneath the churning mud. His cane slipped, skidding sideways, and he stumbled forward with a grunt. Rusty lunged, barking louder, but it was too late. Ollie's body twisted, his arms flailing for balance, and then he fell. His head struck a jagged rock, half buried in the earth, a dull crack swallowed by the storm's fury. He crumpled like a rag doll, his cane rolling away, lost in the flood. Rusty froze, his bark dying in his throat. The rain pounded down, soaking Ollie's still form, turning the dirt beneath him into a dark spreading stain. Blood, bright at first, then diluted by the water, trickled from his temple, mixing with the mud. Rusty whimpered, a high, broken sound, and nosed at Ollie's hand. It was limp, cold already, the fingers curled inward like they were reaching for something they'd never grasp. "Ollie," the dog seemed to say with every nudge, every whine. "Get up, please." But Ollie didn't move. His chest didn't rise, his eyes didn't flutter. The rain washed over him, pooling in the hollows of his coat, as if the sky itself wanted to erase him. Rusty pawed at his arm, his claws scraping against the wet fabric, leaving faint tears. He licked Ollie's face, tasting salt and blood and rain, but there was no response, no raspy laugh, no gentle pat. The old man was gone, stolen by the path they'd walked 1,000 times before. The forest seemed to close in, the trees looming like silent witnesses. Rusty stood over Ollie, his small body trembling, his fur plastered to his skin. He barked again, louder this time, a desperate plea that echoed through the storm. The sound bounced off the trunks, fading into the roar of the rain, unanswered. He didn't understand, not yet. To Rusty, Ollie was invincible, the steady heartbeat of his world. This couldn't be the end. It couldn't quote hours passed, though Rusty didn't know it. The rain didn't stop, relentless and cruel, turning the path into a quagmire. His paws sank into the mud as he paced around Ollie, circling, guarding. He'd lie down beside him, pressing his soaked body against Ollie's side, then stand again, whining, nudging. The cold seeped into his bones, but he didn't care. His eyes stayed on Ollie's face, waiting for the moment those cloudy blue eyes would open, waiting for the smile that would make everything right. The storm raged on, a beast with no mercy. Water streamed around them, carving little rivers in the dirt, tugging at Ollie's coat like it wanted to drag him away. Rusty growled at it, snapping at the flood as if he could fight it back. His voice grew hoarse, his barks turning to whimpers, but he didn't leave. He couldn't. This was their path, their place. Ollie had always come back to him, when he lagged behind, when he rested too long at the oak. He'd come back now too. He had to. Footsteps broke through the haze of rain, heavy and uneven. A figure emerged from the gloom, a hiker, bundled in a yellow slicker, his face shadowed by a hood. He stopped short, his breath catching as he saw the scene: the old man sprawled in the mud, the little dog standing sentinel. "Oh God." The man muttered, his voice barely audible over the storm. He knelt beside Ollie, pressing fingers to his neck, then shook his head. Too late, far too late. Rusty didn't move, as the man stood, didn't flinch as he pulled a phone from his pocket and spoke words the dog couldn't understand. The hiker glanced at Rusty, his eyes softening with pity. "Come on, pup," he said, reaching out. "You can't stay here." But Rusty bared his teeth, a low growl rumbling in his chest. The man hesitated, then stepped back. "All right," he sighed, "I'll get help." He lifted Ollie's body, grunting under the weight, and carried him away, disappearing into the rain. Rusty watched, his heart pounding, his legs trembling. Ollie was leaving him, and he didn't know why. He barked once, twice, a frantic cry that tore at his throat, but the figure didn't turn back. The path was empty now, just mud and water, and the echo of loss. Rusty sank down where Ollie had fallen, his paws pressing into the spot, still warm with the old man's fading presence. The rain hit his whimpers, blending them with its endless drone. He rested his head on the ground, his nose inches from the rock that had taken everything. The forest stood silent, the storm a cruel shroud around him. He'd wait forever, if he had to. Ollie would come back, he always did. But deep down, in the part of him that felt the cold more than the hope, Rusty knew something had broken, something bigger than the path beneath his paws. The rain didn't stop, not that day, nor the next. It fell in a steady, mournful rhythm, soaking the forest until the path was more water than earth. Rusty stayed where Ollie had fallen, his small body hunched against the storm, his paws planted in the mud like roots. The rock that had stolen Ollie jutted from the ground beside him, slick with rain and stained with a faint, fading red. Rusty's eyes, once bright with mischief, were dull now, fixed on the spot where the hiker had carried Ollie away. He didn't move, didn't bark, he just waited. The first day blurred into night, the gray sky darkening to a bruised purple. Rusty's fur clung to his frame, matted and heavy, dripping water into the puddles at his feet. The cold gnawed at him, seeping through his skin, but he didn't feel it, not really. His world had shrunk to this patch of broken path, this hollow space where Ollie should have been. He'd lie down sometimes, curling into a tight ball, his nose pressed to the mud as if he could still smell Ollie's scent beneath the rain. Then he'd stand again, ears twitching at every rustle, every distant snap, hoping it was Ollie coming back. The villagers found him the next morning. They came with umbrellas and coats, their boots squelching through the mire. A woman with a kind face knelt beside him, her voice soft. "Poor thing," she murmured, holding out a piece of bread. Rusty's nose twitched, his stomach growling. He hadn't eaten since the walk, but he didn't take it. He turned his head away, his gaze sliding back to the path. The woman sighed, setting the bread in the mud. "He's waiting for the old man," she said to the others. "Ollie's gone, but he doesn't know." They tried again that afternoon. A man with rough hands and a gruff voice brought a rope, looping it gently around Rusty's neck. "Come on, Mutt," he said, tugging. Rusty growled, low and fierce, his teeth flashing in the dim light. The man yanked harder, but Rusty dug his paws deeper, his body trembling with effort. The rope slipped free, and the man stumbled back, cursing under his breath. "Stubborn little beast," he muttered, wiping rain from his face. "Let him stay then, he'll come when he's ready." But Rusty didn't come. Days stretched into a week, then two. The rain softened to a drizzle, then a mist, but it never truly stopped, as if the sky shared his grief. His fur grew filthy, caked with mud that hardened in clumps. His paws cracked, raw from standing in the wet, cold earth, little cuts opening where the stones pressed too hard. Hunger clawed at his belly, a sharp twisting pain that woke him from shallow sleep. The villagers left food, scraps of meat, crusts of bread, but he'd only nibble, just enough to quiet the ache, then return to his vigil. His body changed, the scruffy coat that once bounced with every step thinned out, revealing the sharp edges of his ribs. His legs wobbled when he stood too long, his tail hung limp, no longer wagging. The villagers whispered about him, their voices carrying on the wind. "He's wasting away," they'd say, shaking their heads, "all for an old man who's never coming back." Some brought blankets, laying them near him, but Rusty ignored them. The mud was his bed now, the path his home. Nights were the hardest. The forest came alive with sounds, owls hooting, branches creaking, the rustle of creatures moving in the dark. Rusty's ears would perk, his head lifting, eyes searching the shadows. Every noise was a promise, a flicker of hope that Ali's boots would crunch through the leaves, that his cane would tap the ground. He'd whimper, a soft broken sound, and wait. But the path stayed empty, the forest indifferent. The hope would fade, and he'd sink back down, his chin resting on his paws, staring into the void. One evening, a child came, a girl with wide eyes and a tattered umbrella. She crouched beside him, unafraid of his matted fur or hollow stare. "Why are you here, doggy?" she asked, her voice small. Rusty didn't move, didn't even blink. She reached out, her fingers brushing his ear, and he flinched, just slightly, but didn't pull away. "My papa says you're sad, 'cause your friend's gone. Is that true?" She waited as if he might answer. When he didn't, she left a biscuit by his side and ran off, her umbrella bobbing through the mist. The biscuit sat there, untouched, until the rain dissolved it into the mud. Rusty didn't care about food anymore, or warmth, or the villagers' pity. He cared about Ali, only Ali. The old man's laugh echoed in his mind, faint and distant, a memory that kept him anchored to this spot. He didn't understand death, didn't know the word, or its weight. To him, Ali was just late, delayed by some unseen errand. He'd waited before minutes, hours, and Ali had always come. This was no different, it couldn't be. The weeks wore on, and Rusty grew weaker. His breaths came shallow, his eyes clouded with exhaustion. The villagers stopped trying to move him, stopped leaving food. "He's made his choice," they'd say, their voices heavy with resignation. The path hardened around him, the mud freezing in the night air, locking his paw prints into the earth, like a map of his loyalty. He'd stand sometimes, swaying on shaky legs, and stare down the trail, willing Ali's shape to appear through the haze. But Ali didn't come, the forest didn't care. The rain fell, softer now, a gentle weep that mirrored Rusty's own. He lay down one night, his body too tired to rise again, and rested his head where Ali's hand had last touched the ground. His eyes fluttered, half open, watching the path stretch into the darkness. He'd wait, through the cold, through the hunger, through the endless aching silence. He'd wait forever, because that's what love was to him, a promise that didn't break, even when everything else did. The night was blacker than any Rusty had known, a thick shroud of darkness that swallowed the forest whole. The rain had finally stopped, leaving behind a damp chill that clung to the air and seeped into the ground where he lay. Rusty's body was a shadow on the broken path, his matted fur blending with the mud, his breath a faint mist in the cold. He hadn't moved much that day. His legs were too weak, his paws too sore, but his eyes stayed open, fixed on the trail where Ali had vanished. The hunger was a dull ache now, a constant companion he barely noticed. He was waiting, still waiting, his heart tethered to a hope that refused to die. The forest was quiet at first, the silence broken only by the drip of water from the leaves. Then came the sounds, soft at first, a rustle in the underbrush, a low growl that rolled through the trees. Rusty's ears twitched, lifting from his head, and his nose wrinkled at a new scent, musky, wild, tinged with rot. He raised his head, slow and stiff, his eyes narrowing as shapes emerged from the shadows. 3 of them, wild dogs, lean and ragged, their ribs sharp beneath patchy fur. Their eyes glinted in the faint moonlight, yellow and hungry, locked on the small figure alone on the path. Rusty stood, his legs trembling beneath him. He was weak. Weeks of starvation and cold had stripped him to bones and will, but he didn't back down. This was his place, Ollie's place, and he'd protect it. He growled, a raspy sound that scraped his dry throat, his lips curling back to show teeth dulled by neglect. The wild dogs paused, heads tilting, sizing him up. The leader, a hulking brute with a torn ear, snarled, its breath puffing out in a cloud of menace. They'd smelled his weakness, his isolation, and they were starving too. The attack came fast, the leader lunged, jaws snapping, and Rusty darted to the side, his paws slipping in the mud. Pain shot through his legs, but he barked, a sharp, defiant sound that echoed through the night. The other two circled, closing in, their growls rising into a chorus of threat. Rusty spun, snapping at the air, but he was too slow, too frail. The leader's teeth caught his flank, tearing through fur and flesh, and Rusty yelped, a high, piercing cry that cut through the stillness. Blood welled, hot and sticky, soaking into the mud beneath him. He fought back, desperation fueling him, his jaws clamped onto the leader's leg, biting down with what little strength he had. The wild dog howled, shaking him off, but Rusty rolled to his feet, staggering. The second dog struck, its teeth sinking into his ear, ripping through the soft skin. Blood sprayed, warm against his face, and he stumbled, his vision blurring. The third joined in, lunging for his hind leg, and Rusty collapsed, his body slamming into the wet earth. Pain exploded, sharp, blinding, a fire that consumed him. They tore at him, a frenzy of hunger and rage. Teeth ripped his shoulder, his side, his legs, shredding fur and muscle. Rusty thrashed, his whimpers turning to screams, raw and guttural, as the wild dogs fed on his defiance. Blood pooled around him, mixing with the mud, turning the path into a gruesome canvas. His strength faded, his movements slowed, but still he fought, snapping, clawing, protecting the spot where Allie had fallen. This was his duty, his love, and he wouldn't let them take it. A shout broke through the chaos, a human voice, loud and frantic. Light flared, a beam cutting through the darkness, as a villager ran toward them, a lantern swinging in his hand. "Get off him," the man yelled, swinging a stick. The wild dogs snarled, hesitating, their mouths red with Rusty's blood. The man charged, striking the leader across the muzzle, and the pack scattered, disappearing into the trees, with low, resentful growls. The lantern clattered to the ground, its glow flickering over the carnage. The villager knelt, his breath hitching as he saw Rusty. The little dog was a wreck, fur torn in clumps, one ear shredded, blood oozing from gashes across his body. His legs twitched, too weak to hold him, and his chest heaved with shallow, ragged breaths. "Oh, you poor bastard," the man whispered, his voice cracking. He reached out, hesitant, but Rusty didn't growl this time. He couldn't. His eyes, cloudy with pain, flickered toward the path, searching for Allie even now. The man scooped him up, gentle despite his rough hands, and Rusty whimpered, a soft, broken sound. Blood dripped from his wounds, staining the villager's coat, but he didn't care. "You're not dying here," the man said, more to himself than to Rusty. He started back toward the village, his boots crunching through the mud, but Rusty squirmed, weak and frantic, his head twisting toward the path. The man tightened his grip. "No, you're done waiting." They hadn't gone far when Rusty's strength gave out. His body went limp, his eyes closing, and the man cursed under his breath, quickening his pace, but Rusty wasn't dead, not yet. In his mind, he was still on the path, still fighting, still guarding. The pain was distant now, a dull throb, beneath the memory of Allie's voice, his touch. He didn't know the villager, didn't care about rescue. He wanted to go back, needed to go back. The man reached the village, shouting for help, but Rusty's world was fading. The horrible night had taken too much, his blood, his strength, his hope. Yet even as his breath slowed, his heart clung to one truth: this wasn't the end. Allie was out there, somewhere beyond the dark, and Rusty would find him. He had to. When the villager set him down, Rusty's eyes cracked open one last time. The path was gone, hidden by houses and lights, but he saw it still, broken, muddy, waiting. With a final shuddering whine, he crawled an inch, then collapsed, his paws reaching for a place he'd never leave. The days after the attack blurred into a haze of pain and cold. Rusty lay where the villager had left him, on a tattered blanket at the edge of the village, just close enough to see the forest shadow. The man had tried to help, cleaned his wounds with shaking hands, wrapped his torn ear in a rag, but Rusty wouldn't stay still, wouldn't eat the scraps offered. His body was a map of ruin, gashes crusted with blood, fur missing in clumps, one leg bent at an odd angle from the wild dog's assault. His breaths came shallow, each one a rasp that rattled in his chest, but his eyes, sunken, stayed fixed on the path he could no longer reach. The villagers watched him from a distance, their whispers floating on the damp air. "He's waiting beyond the rain," an old woman said, her voice trembling with something like awe. For Ali, even now, they'd buried the old man days ago, in a quiet corner of the churchyard, but no one told Rusty, not that he'd understand. To him, Ali wasn't gone, just lost, wandering somewhere out there in the mist. The rain had softened to a drizzle, a gentle weep that mirrored the tears no one shed aloud. It soaked the blanket, seeped into Rusty's wounds, but he didn't flinch. Pain was nothing compared to the ache in his heart. His strength faded with every hour. The hunger that once gnawed at him dulled, replaced by a creeping numbness that spread from his paws to his core. His ribs pressed sharp against his skin, his tail lay still, a lifeless curl in the mud. The villagers stopped bringing food, there was no point. "He's made up his mind," a man muttered, turning away. "He's waiting to die," but it wasn't death Rusty sought. It was Ali, always Ali, the anchor of his world, the promise he'd never break. The forest loomed beyond the village, its trees swaying in the wind, their branches whispering secrets Rusty couldn't hear. He'd stare at them, his head resting on the blanket, and imagine the path, the broken stretch of dirt, where Ali's boots had last touched the earth. He wanted to go back, needed to, but his body betrayed him. When he tried to stand, his legs buckled, sending him crashing down with a pitiful whimper. The effort tore open a wound on his side, fresh blood trickling into the dirt, but he didn't care. He dragged himself an inch, then two, his claws scraping the ground, reaching for a place he'd never reach again. Night fell, cold and clear, the first night without rain in weeks. The sky opened wide, stars blinking through the dark like eyes watching from above. Rusty's breath slowed, each one a struggle, a faint wheeze that barely stirred the air. He lay still now, too weak to move, his head tilted toward the forest. The villagers had gone to their homes, their lanterns dimming one by one, leaving him alone with the silence. It was just him and the path in his mind, the memory of Ali's voice calling his name. The cold deepened, frost creeping over the ground, glazing the blanket in a thin sheen. Rusty's eyes fluttered, half open, their light fading. He didn't feel the chill, didn't feel the pain anymore. His world was shrinking, narrowing to a single point, Ali. He saw him sometimes, in the haze of his failing sight, a shadow on the path, a hand reaching out, a laugh carried on the wind. It wasn't real, but to Rusty, it was enough. He whined, a soft broken sound, his last plea to the night. Then the air shifted. The drizzle stopped completely, the clouds parting to reveal a moon pale and full, its glow spilling over the village, the forest, the broken dog on the blanket. Rusty's head lifted, just an inch, his ears twitching as if he heard something. Footsteps, maybe, or the tap of a cane. His eyes widened, a flicker of brightness returning, and he stared into the sky. The stars blurred, the moon softened, and there, in the shimmer of light, he saw it Ali, standing tall, his coat unpatched, his smile whole. "Rusty boy," the vision seemed to say, "you've waited long enough." Rusty barked, a weak trembling sound that broke halfway, more breath than voice. His tail twitched, a single wag, the first in weeks. The effort cost him, his body shuddering, but he didn't care. Ali was there, beyond the rain, beyond the pain, waiting for him. Rusty's head sank back to the blanket, his eyes still locked on the sky, and he let out a sigh, long and slow, as if releasing every hurt he'd carried. The villagers found him the next morning, when the sun rose cold and golden over the frost-kissed earth. Rusty was still, his body curled as if asleep, his paws tucked beneath him. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, a faint curve to his mouth that might have been a smile. The blanket beneath him was stiff with ice, his fur dusted with frost, but he didn't look broken anymore. He looked whole, like he'd found what he'd been searching for. They stood around him, silent at first, their breaths fogging in the crisp air. "He's gone," a woman said, her voice thick. "Finally gone," a man nodded, wiping his eyes with a sleeve. He waited till the rain stopped, till he knew. They didn't know what he'd seen, what he'd felt in that last moment, but they saw the peace on his face and understood. Rusty hadn't died alone. Not really. The forest stood quiet, the path hidden beyond the trees, but it didn't matter anymore. Rusty was free, free of the mud, the cold, the endless weight. The villagers lifted him gently, blanket and all, and carried him to the churchyard where Ali lay. They'd bury him there, beside his old man, where the rain couldn't touch him anymore. Beyond the rain, beyond the pain, Rusty had found his way home. The morning sun climbed slow and pale over the village, casting long shadows across the frost-dusted ground. Rusty's body lay still on the blanket, a small broken shape cradled by the villagers, who'd gathered around him. Their faces were drawn, eyes red from sleeplessness or tears they wouldn't admit to shedding. The air was sharp with cold, their breaths puffing out in quiet clouds as they stood in a loose circle, unsure what to say. He was just a dog, a scruffy, stubborn mutt, but to them he'd become something more, a story carved into the earth, where he'd waited. A man with rough hands, the one who'd saved him from the wild dogs, stepped forward. His coat was still stained with Rusty's blood, a mark he hadn't washed away. "He deserves to be with Ali," he said, his voice gruff but steady. The others nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through the group. They lifted the blanket together, gentle as if Rusty might still feel their touch, and carried him toward the churchyard. His weight was nothing now, his body lightened by hunger and loss, but their steps were slow, reverent, as if bearing something sacred. The churchyard was a quiet place, tucked at the edge of the village, where the forest shadow didn't quite reach. Ali's grave was marked by a simple stone, weathered and plain, etched with his name and dates. No one bothered to read anymore. The villagers set Rusty down beside it, the blanket folding around him like a shroud. A woman with a scarf pulled tight around her shoulders knelt, her fingers brushing the frost from his fur. "You found him, didn't you?" she whispered, her voice catching. "You waited till you did." They dug the grave by hand, the earth hard and unyielding from the cold. Shovels scraped and thudded, the sound a dull rhythm against the silence. The frost cracked beneath their blades, revealing dark soil that smelled of roots and decay. It wasn't deep, Rusty was small, and the ground fought them, but it was enough. They laid him in, blanket and all, his body curling naturally into the hollow, as if he'd chosen it himself. A boy, the girl's brother from days before, placed a biscuit beside him, his small hands trembling. "For the trip," he mumbled, stepping back. The stone came next. It was a flat gray slab, pulled from the path where Ali had fallen. The man with rough hands chiseled it with a knife, his movements clumsy but determined. "Rusty," he carved, the letters uneven, followed by the dog who waited. No dates, no flourish, just the truth, simple and raw. They set it beside Ali's, the two markers side by side, a pair reunited in the quiet earth. The villagers stood back, hats in hands, staring at the graves, as the sun climbed higher, melting the frost into tiny beads of water that glistened like tears. Word spread fast. By afternoon, people from neighboring villages came, drawn by the tale of the little dog who'd waited beyond the rain. They walked the path, now drying, its mud hardening into cracked ridges, and stopped where Rusty had stood for weeks. His paw prints were still there, pressed deep into the earth, preserved by the cold and the villagers' care not to tread on them. Some knelt, tracing the marks with their fingers, their faces tight with emotion. "Never seen anything like it," a man said, his voice thick. "Love like that, it breaks you." The story grew, carried on the wind like the seeds of a dandelion. Travelers passing through would hear it from the villagers, their voices hushed with a mix of pride and sorrow. "He didn't eat, didn't move, just waited," they'd say, pointing to the path. "Even when the wild dogs came, he fought to stay." Children told it to each other, wide-eyed, adding bits of wonder. A ghost of Ali calling Rusty's name, a light in the forest the night he died. The truth didn't matter, the feeling did. Rusty became a legend, a small scruffy saint of loyalty and loss. The path changed over time. Spring came, softening the mud, and grass crept over the edges, but Rusty's print stayed, a stubborn scar in the earth. People left things there, flowers, mostly wild ones picked from the forest, their petals wilting in the sun. A child left a toy bone, whittled from wood. An old woman left a scrap of cloth, torn from her shawl. They weren't offerings, not really, just pieces of their hearts, laid down for a dog who'd given his. The villagers kept it clear, pulling weeds, chasing off animals that sniffed too close. It was sacred now, their broken path. Years passed, and the grave settled into the churchyard, moss creeping over the stones. Ali's name faded, worn by weather, but Rusty's stayed sharp, the villagers touching it up when it dulled. They'd tell the story to their grandchildren, sitting by the fire, their voices low. He waited beyond the rain, they'd say, and when it stopped, he went to find him. The kids would listen, eyes shining, and ask if Rusty was happy now. Oh yes, the old ones would nod, he's with Ali. That's all he ever wanted. The forest grew taller, the village quieter, but the path remained, a winding thread, tying past to present. People still walked it, pausing where Rusty's prints marked the ground, and felt a lump in their throats. It wasn't just the loyalty that broke their hearts, or the pain he'd endured. It was the horrible beautiful truth woven into his story. Love could hold you to a place, to a person, even when they were gone, even when it cost everything. Rusty had waited, not because he had to, but because he couldn't do anything else. And so, the heart-wrenching end wasn't an end at all. It was a beginning of tales told, of paw prints kept, of a little dog who'd loved so fiercely that time couldn't erase him. Beyond the rain, beyond the grave, Rusty and Ali walked the path together, forever etched into the earth, and the souls of those who remembered.